Good morning, everyone. So my name is Miguel Gomez, and I'm a senior research fellow with the Center on Asia and Globalization at the Kuan School of Public Policy. And I will be serving as the moderator for today's Counterpoint Southeast Asia webinar. So for those of us who are attending here for the first time, particularly for the audience members and a few of our speakers today, Counterpoint Southeast Asia is a webinar and policy brief series that addresses questions of strategic significance to the region, i.e. Southeast Asia, by inviting diverse perspectives from experts, such as the four individuals that we have here with us today. And each iteration of Counterpoint tackles a crucial theme or topic. And today specifically, we are addressing the question of emergent and disruptive technologies, EDTs, and what it would mean for the region. So phenomena such as artificial intelligence and cyberspace are regularly touted as harbingers of change, with references to their ability to connect societies, enable commerce, and empower the defense sector. Advocates of these technologies assert that adopting EDTs will revolutionize interstate affairs. That being said, however, we still have to acknowledge the fact that the leaders in this area are established state actors, read great powers, given the resources and capabilities that are associated with these respective technologies. Moreover, the resurgence of great power competition has resulted in restrictive policies that attempt to curtail adversarial relationships, such as the recent Chips and Science Act coming from the United States. From the perspective of Southeast Asia, and more generally small and middle powers, these actions have a direct impact as their relationships with these actors that are competing with one another shape the degree to which they can access these technologies in order to advance their respective interests. So faced with the desire to employ EDTs to pursue social and economic goals, ASEAN and its respective member states is caught in a crossroads and need to answer a key fundamental question. Will ASEAN seek alignment or independence when pursuing emergent technologies? So to help us address these questions today, we've invited four speakers, four experts, if I may say, across the region. Before I introduce them, I would like to remind each of them that they have 5 to 7 minutes to present their key arguments. After each is done with their presentation, we'll open the floor to questions and discussions. For those in the audience, please feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A box, which I have now set up as well on my screen so that I can keep track of what is being asked. Do not worry about waiting for all the presentations to finish. If you have a burning question to ask, just feel free to type it in the Q&A and I will proceed to ask them once we reach that portion of the webinar. So with these points in mind, I'll go on to briefly introduce the speakers in the order in which they will present. So these are very brief introductions for their full profiles and their full impressive profiles. You can refer to the biographies at the CAG website. So kicking us off, we have Elina Nor. She's a senior fellow for the Asia program at Carnegie, where she focuses on developments in Southeast Asia, particularly the impact and implications of technology in reshaping power dynamics, governance, nation building in the region. Following her, we have our very own Jassy Chang. She's a research associate with the Center on Asia and Globalization at the Kuan School of Public Policy. Her research interests include US-China technological competition, ASEAN cyber resilience, AI and semiconductor supply chain, as well as cross-strait relations. This is followed by Fitri Bintang Timur, who is part of the Department of Politics and International Relations at the CSIS. Her research focus includes peacekeeping, defense and security in the Asia Pacific, women in peace and security, non-traditional security, cybersecurity, as well as Indonesian politics and foreign policy. Last but definitely not the least, Derek Balaji is a lecturer at the International Studies Department at De La Salle University in Manila. His research interests include Philippine foreign and bilateral relations, the U.S. Philippine Security Alliance, geopolitical contests, and Southeast Asia and Northeast Asian security. So we have an impressive lineup with us today. And let's start off with Elina. So this is a counterpoints webinar, and I believe like what she has to say is interesting in that it does not go with the usual narrative that's associated with emerging technology within the region. So I yield the floor to you, Elina.
Thank you, Miguel. Thank you for having me as part of this initiative. When you asked for our synopsis, I did warn you that I was going to go against the grain.
Yeah.
And so I hope I won't disappoint. I have three main arguments to table. I know very often the framing is of, oh, where do Southeast Asian countries fit within the whole geopolitical competition framing? But A, I'm tired of that. And B, I've begun to think a little more deeply about what it is that tech is supposed to do for us. And so with that preface, let me offer you my first point. I'm tired of this framing because it reduces Southeast Asian countries and ASEAN as a grouping to derivatives of power centers, whether it's China or whether it's the US or whether it's Europe. And it ignores the fact that we in Southeast Asia, whether it's government or people in track 2 like us, are very much aware of the risks of aligning with any particular power on any particular issue in tech. You know, and I didn't quite rant in my paper, but it brought to mind some of the rhetoric that was coming out of the Trump administration, for example, in the US, when the government decided to roll out its Clean Network Initiative. The underlying supposition was that the Chinese networks and anything associated with Chinese technology was therefore dirty. So it's US clean, China dirty. You know, and this is a very simplistic, reductive way of looking at things. I think all of us on this screen and in the audience, we are very cognizant of the risks, again, of tech coming from the different power centers. Second argument is that this framing as well as kind of status framing ignores the very complex ecosystem of tech in Southeast Asia. We often think of governments caught in the middle, but it's not only governments making decisions around tech. The private sector industry is very much a key player in the tech landscape. And apart from business, apart from industry, you have people like us, researchers who are interested in many different aspects of the tech landscape. We have lawyers drafting up all sorts of regulations and legislation. There are activists who care about different angles around the tech landscape. And I think a part of this is very much seen, this innovation from all these different players just interacting together in kind of the robust startup scene in Southeast Asia. And in my paper, I name, of course, the giants in Southeast Asia, Grab, Gojek, and Tokopedia, which merged to become Go2 as well as Sea. And so I think this reductive framing of geopolitical competition in Southeast Asia and tech really ignores this very nuanced and textured landscape around the tech ecosystem in the region. Finally, most importantly, I think, and I've been thinking about this a lot more carefully, is that this framing actually detracts regional policymakers and some of us as well in the research community from focusing on what I believe to be the most important constituents of tech. And there are two: people and the planet. Because if tech is supposed to serve us as people, then it really needs to do justice to us. And I'll go a little bit into that very briefly. The other constituent of tech is the planet, because we extract so much from the planet to build these systems, to build these machines that are meant to serve us. We often forget about the quote-unquote externalities that go into this tech calculation. And a lot of it is very extractive, it's commodified, and it really speaks to kind of the power asymmetries that we're seeing, for example, in the whole debate around critical infrastructure, critical minerals surrounding green tech, for example. So just very quickly on people and the planet, in my paper, I list out three quick points. One is on data. one is on labor, and one is on the environment, because all these different subpoints that I've laid out go to making tech. We often think of tech as rational. We often think of AI as like a bunch of algorithms, mathematical equations, but really tech is relational, and it goes back to these ties with us and with the planet. So on data, I think it really bodes a lot of recalling that data is societal. It's a societal construct. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. And therefore, we need to think very carefully about the bias around data, i.e. the quality of data, as well as who is crafting the narratives around this data that goes into feeding, for example, AI algorithms. Many of us are very techno-optimistic, but I think we really need to be critiquing kind of the purpose of scraping and platforming, even selling this data. What are we optimizing for? What are we selling for? And all this data needs constant human review, and a lot of it is very menial, very mentally intensive work. Just think of content moderators. Don't think of content creators, think of content moderators. In our region, in the Philippines, for example, a lot of the content moderation that takes place actually reduces us human beings to just sifting through sometimes like really horrible images and words, you know, just images of murder, sexual violence, porn, child sexual abuse material. Think of the labor that goes into that, and think of how much we undervalue the labor for us to see the things that we see on the internet. Finally, on resources, you know, we often think again of just the greenhouse gas emissions and sort of the just the greenhouse gas emissions and water consumption, energy consumption behind data centers, for example, that support AI systems. But we don't think of the extraction of raw materials in the production phase. We don't think of the transportation emissions in the logistics phase, and we don't think of the end cycle. What happens when these huge data centers, for example, or the component parts within deplete or are too old and need to either be recycled or need to be tossed out? Where does all this go? And we need to rethink how we see the environmental impact in terms of the total life cycle of some of these systems. So let me stop there. I know I'm probably been a bit more contrarian than expected, so I welcome questions.
Thank you, Elina, for that. I wouldn't say that it's contrarian, but you do raise interesting points regarding not the secondary effects, but actually the parallel effects that, or parallel factors that we need to consider when we look at our attempts to exploit these technologies to meet our specific objectives. And I think this is crucial because these are the things that, in the rush towards being the best, being the fastest, we tend to overlook, which is unfortunate, but unfortunate both because it's happening and it is something that's not completely new. We keep on doing this regardless of the technology that we try to develop, but it is what it is, and it's important that someone is asking these questions. Now, complementing actually the perspective that you offer, we now move on to Jassy, who provides us a more cooperative perspective within the region on addressing the mainstream concerns with regards to pursuit of these technologies. So, Jassy, if you will.
Thanks, Miguel, for inviting me, and good morning, everyone. It's my honor to be here today to be part of the conversation. I completely agree with Elina that great power competition shouldn't be a distraction. And ASEAN has a very vibrant ecosystem, and also there are societal, environmental implications to consider. But today I will try to answer Miguel's question. But before answering that, I think we need to clarify what we meant by alignment, because it's important to understand the terms we are using, because as we know, terminology matters. So in the past, the term alignment usually meant forming military or strategic alliances to counter the specific powers, or to protect the shared security interest. And back during the Cold War, countries like India and Indonesia, they started the non-aligned movement to stay independent and not get caught up in the rivalry between the US, the Soviet Union, and their allies. But now, over the time, the non-alignment movement grew to include 120 countries, including all 10 ASEAN member states, who wanted to stay neutral and not side with any major powers. But nowadays, alignment actually has a broader meaning. It's not just about forming a formal military alliances. It's also about how the countries position themselves politically and strategically in response to what's happening in the world. And also in the tech domain, alignment can also mean working together on projects to benefit everyone involved. There's a cooperation sense to it. So now back to answer your questions. Well, ASEAN seek alignment or independence when pursuing emerging technology. In the traditional sense, ASEAN countries do not seek formal alignment with any superpower bloc. Non-alignment is actually documented as its fundamental principles in ASEAN Security Community Plan of Action. But in the non-traditional sense, under the broader meaning we mentioned just before, it's also not a simple either or question, Instead, ASEAN prioritizes both cooperation and also autonomy. They highlight flexibility. And when it comes to the great power competition, they want to stay neutrality. They want to stay neutral. So they have made it very clear that their approach to big power competition is through cooperation and stay neutral. So we all say that the ASEAN member state, they believe in collaborating when it makes sense and staying neutral when it doesn't. I think I will give the example here. So that is Singapore. They have a very stable government and strong tech infrastructure. It has become a hotspot for all the tech companies. So we can see companies like Tencent, Alibaba, Google, Amazon, IBM, and Microsoft, they're all set up here. They bring in all the talents and all the critical resources crucial for developing artificial intelligence. Even now, we have the tension between the US and China. Like, for example, Singapore Prime Minister already made it very clear that Singapore doesn't want to pick sides. Rather, they want to do business with everyone. So I will give another example here. Is last year, Singapore actually has awarded data center contract to 4 companies. 2 of them are from China, which are GDS, and another one is ByteDance. And there's another 2 from America, which are the Equinix and Microsoft. So the choice, you can see some like the play of it. But some people will say the choice to evenly split for them is like geopolitical element to it. But is it the case in Southeast Asia? Probably it's not necessary. So what we learn from the region is that the government don't necessarily look things from the geopolitical point of view. The approach is more pragmatic and realistic in its pursuit of emergent technology. I will give another example here is Malaysia. So they want to position itself as a hub of data centers. They want to draw in a lot of investment by offering the tech incentives as well. And they want to attract a lot of major tech giants like Microsoft and Google to their country. But not just the US and China, there are also other company like Japan's NTT Data. They already set up, it's a 6th data center in Malaysia's Cyber Java Science Park. So the Malaysia strategy is inclusive. They want to attract a diverse range of international players related to the industry. So again, the countries in Southeast Asia, they don't necessarily look things from the geopolitical point of view. I think another thing I also want to highlight here is the active role of ASEAN in the in the global AI landscape. I think this is the aspect that is sometimes overlooked, but I think it's crucial. I also want to echo Elina about the vibrant tech landscape in the region. So right now we know the US and China, they are the big players in AI, right? But Southeast Asia is actually has a very huge potential in it. So for example, like recent ASEAN Digital Economic Framework Agreement, DEFA, ASEAN's digital economy could double to US 2 trillion by 2030. Some people might say Southeast Asia, Southeast Asian country, they are still in the early stage of AI adoption, but 6 out of them already have implemented national strategy in the past 5 years, including Singapore, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines. In just 2 months of 2024, we also seen a very exciting AI project in the region. So for example, Vietnam already developed its generative AI programs called VIGPT. It caters their local language and cultures. And another one is Thailand. They introduced the BIT-NET, which is an AI platform for the cancer detection. And ASEAN as a whole, it's important one is in February, they released the ASEAN Guide on AI Governance and Ethics. So it really shows serious about AI, serious about responsible AI, and that everybody is aware of all the risks and the challenges associated with AI. And they don't follow the EU rules. They want to take the lead in its own, make sure the AI is tailored to the culture of the society. So I would say, like, in this evolving landscape of politics, technology, because now we're talking about AI, but probably a few years later, it's not emerging anymore. And also we can see the dynamic of the US and China. Now they are working on, AI cooperation. So the important thing here is to see how Southeast Asia, they fit into all this geopolitics and to this AI power dynamics, how they fit into this picture. So they actually have a very active role in shaping AI and driven by their ambitions and also their cultures, ideas. So it's not just about big power rivalry. I will stop there.
Yeah, thanks for that perspective, Jassy. And I think it's not at all surprising that ASEAN is quite responsive to these developments, especially given the potential benefits that investment in these technologies would give the region. So the projects that we are seeing right now are on the one hand to be expected, but the question here that we probably also will be looking at with the next 2 speakers is to what extent do we actually see a unified front when it comes to navigating this space within the region? So our next speaker, Fitriani, will be giving us an overview, a country-specific overview of how Indonesia is approaching this question of alignment, quote-unquote alignment, in pursuit or not, in pursuit of its goals with AI. So Fitriani, if you care to take the floor.
Thank you, Miguel, and thank you, Counterpoint Asia. I agree with Jesse's point. I think ASEAN is seeking strategic autonomy and not, have to align with the great power dynamics and make the region its own color. In parts for Indonesia, the decision is based on its post-colonial history and troubled internal tension. It makes Indonesia prioritize sovereignty and the likelihood to norms and establish rules-based order. Indonesia embraced new technology because it's seen as it has the transformative potential to feed its large population and leverage the developing country to advanced country, if so you will, in the future. But the question whether Indonesia will seek alignment or independent in its technological pursuits hinge on various considerations. And to some, I provide two. One is philosophical. The second is the landscape of reality. Philosophically, Indonesia have, as mentioned by Jesse in the independent and active foreign policy doctrine that rooted in the Cold War that serve as a decisive factor to pursuit of technological independence, if you will. And therefore, that foreign policy doctrine emphasized the non-alignment, strategic autonomy, and fostering collaboration with the global South country. As such, Indonesia is seeking the fora of the UN, the G20, the non-aligned movement, and ASEAN to build its normative framework of using AI and discourse of ethics, the good use of advanced technology, emerging technology for the people, for economy. And as such, in this international and regional fora, Indonesia sees the new technologies may pose threats, not inherently though, but through the misuse and irresponsible action by actors. So therefore, Indonesia's way of bringing regional organization, ASEAN, the UN, is not limiting the technology adoption and use, but ensuring that no malicious actor exploiting it on the expense of other people that seek economic advantage. And Indonesia needs technology to increase the welfare of the 280 million people. But again, that's this philosophical part, but in practice, in the reality part, procuring technology need resources. And for developing countries, there is the reality of competing demands, national demands, national priorities, and limited resources. And therefore, the need of allocation and prioritization of investment. And how does Indonesia do it in a way that as a country that is developing has limited resource, and therefore it seeks to collaborate, as mentioned by Jesse before, with major global technological player. For example, Indonesia seek partnership with companies that have advanced AI technology, including Google, Huawei, Microsoft, NVIDIA, and Cisco, to facilitate technology transfer and upskilling for Indonesia talent. Indonesia also, following the Singapore example of providing golden visas and residency permit, for example, last year to the OpenAI CEO, Salman Adman, to come to Indonesia and develop the country AI ecosystem. But from the study that our team did last year at CSA Indonesia that will be launched end of this month, March 2024, we found that while Indonesia relies on diverse areas of international partners for its technological needs, the hardware supplier remains heavily on China and China products. For example, it's the contracts for crucial backbone telecommunication infrastructure project, the base transceiver station, the BTS that lines the countries, has been awarded to Chinese firm like Huawei and ZTE due to its cost effectiveness and economic technology competitiveness. Meanwhile, in software domain, the US still leading to provide software solution and digital platform. But the concern of this duality is how Indonesia can reduce the foreign dependency from these two great powers and to cultivate technological independence. And the solution is Indonesia seek to diversify its pool of advanced technology supplier beyond Chinese and American firms. For example, Indonesia does so by procuring advanced surveillance AI-enabled radars from Thales, France, and for example, reconnaissance drones from Turkish Aerospace, which is European as well as developing countries, South countries cooperation to seek and to ask for technological transfer, logistical support, and training programs aim to develop Indonesia indigenous technological expertise. having the experience that because of the Timor-Leste experience that Indonesia received a veto of supply from the Western countries because of the issue of human rights. And therefore, now trying to seek balance of the neither of the great powers. And okay, maybe my time is almost over. To conclude, Indonesia is seeking technological independence to the extent that it is capable of, with a limited resource. And it is underscored by the domestic imperative. In the same time, aspire to get maximum strategic autonomy, getting from both China and the US. And it wishes for its domestic innovation, as Elina mentioned, the unicorn, the go-to and the Gojek and the other unicorn that's developing. The government has even have 1,000 startup and try to establish 10 more unicorn, but there's always a resource constraint, talent constraint, and to an extent, political constraint. We can discuss that later in the Q&A. Thank you so much, Miguel.
Thanks for that overview. And I think it's interesting that, at least for Indonesia, we're looking at investment or development in these technologies, not just for the sake of them, but approaching them through the context of learned lessons in the past, and also recognizing the inherent limitations when it comes to developing these technologies. So the resources that you need to actually obtain this, while it will be while at the same time realizing that you can only do so much, right? So that's a really interesting perspective. So moving on to our final speaker, who will also give us a local perspective, this time from that of the Philippines. So can we call on Derek to round out the presentation sessions?
Hi, thanks, Miguel. So first of all, my sincerest thanks to the organizers for inviting me to this timely event. And of course, to the fantastic speakers who came before me. I think I will pretty much be echoing a more nuanced example in the Philippines, as shared by the previous speakers. To answer the question, I will proffer the Philippines' experience with China's digital Silk Road. My response will be rooted in a study that we are conducting through a research partnership with a research organization and a local university here in the Philippines. So I'm here today in my personal capacity as part of the research team who is presently developing the output. So the project that we are doing is very much an enterprise at looking at the norm building dynamics between China and the Philippines, right? Our team specifically looks at how this dynamics spills over in various aspects of Manila's digital transformation, such as in tech norms, ethical norms, and regulations. So answering the question is posed by Miguel. It's quite dependent on the norm building dynamic between ASEAN member states, Philippines in my case, and other externalities. Complexities in the Philippine digital sector were spurred by the entrance and increasing prominence of Chinese tech and influence in its economy and in the value chain. China, after all, is the Philippines' largest trading partner. And of course, China's Belt and Road Initiative, right, more specifically through the Digital Silk Road, presents both opportunities for economic collaboration and challenges. It brings in opportunities, innovation, competition, but alongside, there are also concerns associated with, say, data security, privacy, and economic dependencies. Its dominance, a foregone conclusion, of course. And the Philippines is actually also similar within Indonesia, as shared by Fitriani. The Philippines is now attempting to address the unintended consequences of one country's dominance in the Philippines digital domain. Given that the Philippines is wedged between China and the US, since they're the two biggest elephants in the room, right? Manila is actually poised to collaborate with the two and to emulate the best norms and practices from the two as well. So in retrospect, maybe to answer the question right away, right? The Philippines is not actively aligned with any single country for reasons unique to its economic and security needs. It's easy to pass off Manila's circumstances of country economically beholden to China and strategically bound with the US, when in truth, its approach to two countries is beholden to domestic needs and quite tempered by security concerns. And I'm echoing here what Elina shared earlier about putting people at the center. The findings of our project point to the fact that there exists no meaningful norm building dynamic between China and the Philippines. This only means that the norm building consensus between Manila and Beijing is not as intimate, say, as the US and the West, and even with ASEAN. This is explained by at least two important observations we made. Firstly, China's presence here in the Philippines is very, very asset-centric, infrastructure-centric, right? The US and the West's engagement, on the other hand, are in contrast, are marked for its more on capacity building initiatives. Secondly, there is a broader lack of discussion surrounding the importance of 4IR, industrial revolution technology, in everyday lives in the Philippines. Allow me to add a bit emphasis on the second point. Now, both houses of the Philippine Congress are startled by the explosion of 4IR technologies in daily lives and have forwarded resolutions, right, in aid of legislations to try to regulate new technologies. There are some bills pending on AI to protect certain sectors from outright automation, against deepfakes, and preserving right labor and working standards. Admittedly, we also found how discussions surrounding the daily and commercial uses of 4IR and relevant technologies are not as advanced or forward-thinking here in the Philippines compared to our other ASEAN neighbors. Under the present administration, right, digitalization or digitization places very high in the agenda. But whether or not high impact results can be achieved in such a short time still remains open to speculation. And there are some institutional reasons for why this is the case. For instance, our Department of Information and Comms Technology is a relatively nascent organization set up around 2016, 2017. And just last month, I think, they launched the National Cybersecurity Plan up until 2028. Our National Privacy Commission, which had been around since 2014, still remains laggard, right, in terms of a budget and appropriation, and could not effectively enforce our national privacy law, which at the time of its passing, served quite a stellar example for the rest of ASEAN, who are now in the process of setting up their own data privacy legislations. Fundings for research and development took a backseat for many years, and the Philippines is now only catching up. And we do not have discussions on important digital topics such as data sovereignty, regulations on AI-driven technologies and sectors, impacts of the technology in sectors and workforce. Legislation has yet to catch up with new and emerging technologies. Lastly, the Philippines still mostly dabbles with basic digital concerns. Of course, the debates here in the Philippines have not really moved past the shadow of national privacy concerns, and the government is still fixated with setting up the infrastructure. And there's nothing wrong with that. It just so happens that the Philippines is dealing really with cross-archipelagic internet connectivity, because there really are still localities who do not have access to basic internet. That is the reality. The Philippine political economy is it's a very big determinant of the Philippines' digitalization trajectory, and that there are inherent interplay with major powers imprints here in the Philippines. For instance, the Philippines digital competition the Philippines still grapples, right, with tech duopoly in the telecom sector. Both of the top service providers host Chinese technologies, both hardware and software, and there was a push to adopt technologies from the West. And a third China-backed alternative telco was also set up in 2016 in efforts to dismantle the duopoly. Another assessment we found was that Filipinos just generally prefer cheaper technology options and would choose whichever brand fits the budget. And it just so happens that Chinese technologies can provide cheaper prices, and this appeals to Filipino preference for cheap options. The Philippines to date is doing its best to diversify its technological portfolio, much like Indonesia, outside of the conventional service providers such as China. And the Philippines always espouses developing cooperative measures with countries it shares its values with, including, of course, ASEAN nations. To cap, the Philippines stands on emerging technologies, as in all other domestic necessities and wants, is driven by internal factors, a desire to protect, to preserve national interest, maybe even to deter aggression. It's important to take note that these wants and needs, however, are tempered by the security realities that it faces outside and even from within. Because it chooses to compartmentalize issues, the Philippines definitely employs a foreign policy that does not outrightly align with any single country, but preserves its agency and independence, affording it wide latitude in managing economic and security interests. However, as established by the discussion so far, right, the reality of emerging 4IR technologies is it's a fast-paced thing, which any country with the right policy backing and political will and even investment could easily pick up and develop. Adopting new technologies can bolster economic growth and posturing, and Manila knows this for sure. The Philippines knows that it needs to do some serious catching up, and the more that it is catching up, the more it realizes that the issue area is one so inextricably linked with geopolitics and geoeconomics. To share one insight from our FGD participant. The comment goes, quote, "The Philippines' digital transformation leapfrogged during the pandemic, but its cybersecurity did not," end quote. This already tells you a lot about the situation and circumstance that the Philippines find itself in. But in the grand scheme of ASEAN development, member states are likewise beholden to its internal idiosyncrasies, much like the case on the Philippines experience. And other ASEAN members, I suspect, will be no different. The question really now rests on three important critical areas: whether ASEAN can make good work of its agreed set of working values and norms on emerging technologies that all member states can align and synchronize with, whether ASEAN can ensure that that synchronization can be insulated from other parties, be it China, the US, even the Quad, or maybe even the AUKUS, and whether we can consistently remind those third parties to abide by ASEAN principles. So I'll end my remarks there. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussions.
So thank you for that extensive overview of what the Philippines is doing, and I may be potentially biased in my reading of your works, being a fellow Filipino as well. But the Philippines is in a interesting situation relative to the rest of the region, given both our material limitations and existing geopolitical realities. But we'll get more into that during the Q&A. We actually have a couple of questions already lined up. And I will be using my moderator powers to weave in my own questions along with these as they come. But first, I will answer the one that's easiest. So we have a question whether this discussion will be posted on YouTube. And the quick answer there is yes, it will definitely be posted on YouTube in the coming weeks. So if you're not able to stick around for the rest of the discussion due to other commitments, don't worry, you'll be able to catch up once this has been uploaded to our respective channels. So I will ask the questions in the order that they appear. So the first one that we have is, how might states stay neutral when infrastructure foundational to technology, cables, and networks are usually developed by one side or the other? Such infrastructure tends to be based on long-term contracts and has path dependency effects. Is it possible to be neutral when providers can use these contracts and networks for coercion? So I think if we unpack this question, this is actually like two separate questions that are being asked. So on the one hand, what is the reality that ASEAN and its respective member states can truly be neutral? And one good example here is the whole question about sovereign AI. Can we develop technologies that are actually domestic or region specific? Do we have those capacities? And at the same time, what stops these external parties from forcing us to align simply because we're dependent on them and we can't just sever those connections overnight? So I don't have any specific order in which I want the panel to answer this. So if you have an answer, just feel free to chime in. Don't feel pressured to answer this if you don't wish to, but it would be great if we can get the insights of everyone on this panel.
I can get the ball rolling if that's okay. I think with specific regard to cables, submarine communication cables, the norm has always been for companies to work together. Because the costs of these cables are so high, usually, there needs to be a consortium of players. And these players have come from different countries. A number of the cables in our oceans around Southeast Asia actually have had consortiums comprising of Chinese players, of American players, of European players, and Southeast Asian players. But over the last couple of decades, we've seen more government interventions in a number of these contracts that have forced the hands of certain players to either exit or to have an advantage over the others. And so the purely business considerations that have really underpinned many of these decisions surrounding subsea cables have really been manipulated, if you'd like, for more geopolitical reasons, for national security concerns. And along with this comes a raft of legislation and regulations in the United States, for example, that premise the functioning of these cables, the location of these cables, the routing of these cables on national security grounds. And so in Southeast Asia, I think what we're facing now is not just a matter of commercial considerations that are quite separate from geopolitical tensions. The two are actually being combined into a very potent and potentially toxic mix for Southeast Asian policy decision makers. So I don't have an easy answer for you. I think what we need to do, first of all, is to raise awareness about these issues. Are we asking the right questions? A lot of our decisions, or a lot of the questions around our decisions on tech in Southeast Asia have been focused primarily on money, investment, trade, commerce, the economy. We're not asking, in my opinion, my humble opinion, the right questions. And maybe we should be more cognizant of the fact that we need to be asking different questions.
Thanks for that that feedback. And just a quick two finger here on this one. I think this whole notion of like dependence, not just on tech, but actually other more fundamental resources that ASEAN would have direct access to, like power generation, for instance. So it's beyond the competition itself. And to your point about the environment, how much does ASEAN actually wish to also sacrifice, given other pressing concerns in our own interest when it comes to the environment, just in pursuit of these goals? So there has to be a balancing and a reconsideration there. But that's just my quick comment there. How does the rest of the panel have anything they wish to add or to answer regarding this question?
And I will probably try to answer it with a very short response. So I think the Southeast Asian countries, I know it's challenging, but it's actually doable. If we look at Singapore's 5G case, like in 2020, now we are talking about 5G Huawei. So in 2020, Singapore, they actually picked Ericsson and Nokia over the Huawei for the 5G networks. So I think what they can do is trying to diversify their sources of the technology, right? And another key is transparency. So they should probably transparent in their contract, and then also along with international cooperation, it can actually ensure that it doesn't fall into to keep the balance of the power and ensure that the infrastructure is not used for coercion. That's my short answer there.
Thanks, Jassy. Derek or Fitri, anything to add?
I more on the point of what Elina raised earlier. Maybe to share the Philippines' experience on this. The Philippines launched its own Philippine domestic submarine cable network, and yes, it was developed by a consortium of various local companies and international partners. But I think the key takeaway to ensure that we remain neutral is to make the space competitive. For instance, our DICT secretary, Ivan Uy, tapped various firms from other nationalities to work with the Filipinos, not just to prefer a certain country or certain firms. So yeah.
Okay. Fitri, do you have anything to add to this, or should we move to the next?
Up to you, but perhaps I will.
I'd like to hear
I will-
everyone's comments. So
Sorry, but I think it depends on each country in Southeast Asia whether they would choose to be neutral or they would want to openly align or procure for a certain country. But the tendency in Indonesia is I think from the in-depth interview that we did and the expert discussion we did was that the concern was as long as the government still have and the Indonesians still have the autonomy to decide who the country will grant the tender to, and the collaborative way through public-private partnership, because as Elina mentioned, the infrastructure is too big, and usually not only one country get to build. For example, for Indonesia, satellite Satria, that connects the internet the whole country. There's BPI France. There's also Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. There's Santander, HSBC. And the technology comes from a different parts. The challenge would how the country have the capacity to combine and merge it together to make the technology work instead of being patchy and disjointed. So I think that is the challenge for within the country as well as the region. If the region then is separated by US bloc or China bloc or our own bloc, for example.
yeah.
Thank you.
So the bottom line seems to be here, it's a particularly complex situation with a lot of moving parts. So there's no easy answer to this one. I ask the forgiveness of the audience, but I'll skip over to a more recent question because I know Elina has time constraints and she will need to leave us quite soon. And this other question is specifically focused on her. So how can member states balance the need for the pursuit of national green energy independence/security against alignment via regional grid? Furthermore, what role do you see for regional frameworks or agreements in facilitating this balance? And how might differences in national capacities and priorities affect the pursuit of a cohesive regional energy strategy? So again, question with a lot of moving parts. So
Yeah.
what do you think about this, Elina?
So you'll have to forgive me, Zach, I believe, asked that question. Energy is not my area. In my remarks, I was simply advocating for a more comprehensive assessment of the entire life cycle of number of these systems, including AI, because very often we focus on only the use part of AI, how much energy is being consumed, how much water is being consumed. We don't focus on the production side. We don't focus on the end life cycle side. So these standards of assessment are already available. Technically, the ISO has standards that we can borrow and adapt specifically for whether it's AI systems, whether it's for data centers or other component parts of any emerging tech. We just need to be thinking a little beyond the box instead of just dismissing some of these impacts on the environment, whether it's the impact to the biosphere or something else, as economic externalities. Because again, the framing has just been about the economy. So sorry to not be able to answer directly.
Well, we appreciate all the thoughts here. And to be perfectly honest, I mean, with emerging technologies, I don't think anyone can genuinely claim to be an expert along with constituent parts, given how new. It is. That being said, does anyone want to weigh in on that question? Anyone more familiar with that? If not, then I think we can move on to the next one. What role can ASEAN states play in data privacy regulation and might it be possible for ASEAN to become a unique technology player that's able to develop tech and framework regulation that allows technology to actually serve the people and the planet. So again, I think this question again harkens back to the question of like, can ASEAN actually be more independent, can be a leader in this field? And if I recall, was it Jassy who mentioned in her essay that she submitted about or did she mention during the presentation about the EU standards being followed? I think it was you, Jassy, who mentioned that one. But this question goes to everyone because I think everyone has touched on this question of regulation during their talking points. So whoever wants to get the ball rolling for this one.
What I mentioned before about the EU AI Act is actually instead of following ASEAN, they created their own one. They have their own AI governance. But again, with this data regulation thing, I think it's also a question in my mind because at the moment we can see each country has their own regulation. So for example, like Singapore, they has a PDPA. And then we can also see like Indonesia and Vietnam, they has their own data localization regulations. So the question is, how can we come up, like there's actually no comprehensive law on data protection. How can the ASEAN as a region come up, like harmonize all the individual regulation and come up with the comprehensive things? It's like, we really need to look into it. But I'm sure like ASEAN will definitely like think about it and come up with something is based on their culture and diversity in the region.
Yeah, so I think this question also comes from I mean, if for those of us who observe ASEAN, we know that our attempts to create a unified front on a lot of issues has not always been that consistent. And with AI or with other emerging technologies like cyber, it's particularly difficult, right, for us to, given like the various interests across different members, plus some of the normative constraints that exist within ASEAN itself, we end up defaulting to, sad to say, the lowest common denominator in order to reach an agreement. But that's something that I believe that we'd have to contend with, especially given like the interest that was highlighted by Derek, by Fitri, of respective ASEAN member states. So would I be correct in saying that the groundwork is, or at least we're moving in the right direction, but how this is going to play out is still quite uncertain? Would it be fair to say that at this point? Okay. Yeah.
Let me offer a counterpoint to that, Miguel, if I may.
Sure.
I had asked, earlier on if we were asking the right questions in Southeast Asia. And I think this issue of data is a prime example of us not really expanding our horizon to questions around data. The person who posed the question had mentioned privacy. Privacy and data protection are often used interchangeably. They're not quite the exact same thing. And so even if a country like Malaysia has the PDPA, the Personal Data Protection Act, it doesn't guarantee privacy. So they're quite things. The corollary to the question of, are we asking the right questions in Southeast Asia, is who are we turning to ask these questions? We often turn to the EU to base our legislation on the GDPR because we are plugged into the global economy as trading countries. But why are we not also looking at some of the innovations, some of the really interesting discussions around open data, the tension between open data and community data, on the other hand, in countries in Africa, in countries like Aotearoa, New Zealand, where the Maori have really revamped data governance frameworks to take ownership for their community. There are all these different sorts of data governance frameworks that are being developed, that are being discussed, that we also need to take into account, not just modeling our data legislation primarily for economic, trading, investment purposes.
Yeah, so I guess that's a very important point that you highlight. And would you say that our tendency to just look at the typical partners just, or at least at the moment, speaks about our wanting to be within our quote unquote comfort zone when thinking about these issues that are we're not willing, or ASEAN as a whole tends to be resistant to solutions that it has not pursued in the past. Would you say that's a fair argument to make?
Yeah, and if I'm being like completely uncharitable, I think it's a lazy cop-out because we're in this race for, I don't know what the end goal is, but we seem to be in this race for tech. And we're not looking around us because we're so single-minded in getting to an endpoint.
Yeah, fair. So I know we're coming up to time for your participation with us. Do you have any for parting? Because I'm gonna ask them at the end if they have any parting remarks. So I'll ask yours now. Do you have any parting remarks for the rest of the panel here and our audience?
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity. I would just encourage all of us, myself included, as a reminder to myself, to go beyond our comfort zones, to look at other parts of the world, primarily the quote-unquote global south, which is often dismissed as undeveloped. But in fact, if you look at some of the scholarship that's taking place on many of these issues, whether it's data or whether it's ethics and guidelines, there are really very interesting discussions, conversations that we need to be more cognizant of in developing our own frameworks and asserting our own agency. So I'll just end it on, thank you so much. I'm sorry
That's a perfect way to end it. Thank you as well for joining us and giving us your very valuable time. So we'll see you around. For the rest of the panel, there's still a lot of questions to be addressed. They're not going to get any easier, unfortunately. So the next one we have is that, what is the panel's position regarding the inter-ASEAN competition for talent and customers? So I think this is the most interesting question because it cites the recent issue or the recent tiff between Thailand, the Philippines, and Singapore regarding Taylor Swift coming over and Singapore having exclusive access to that. But it does speak to this reality that we're seeing with emerging tech such as cyber, for instance, where you have individual member states pursuing their own interests, simply because, again, ASEAN, for us to agree on anything, we tend to resolve down to the lowest common denominator. So what's the reality actually of what's the possibility of actually having a unified front in this case, rather than having, as the person who asked this question put it, stealthily out competing one another behind the scenes? So is there actually a possibility of ASEAN coming up with a united front when it comes to these technologies? I know this is a very hard question, and I personally do not have an answer for this one, so I defer to the rest of the panel.
Can I answer it in a way
Sure, of course.
that we shouldn't be seeing it as like Elina was, before she left, was mentioning we're on a race to something we don't know. And I think the way that the ASEAN as a regional organization, it thrives so far in decades of its existence is because we hold on to the lowest common denominator, and we make it work for countries that is slowly building its knowledge and slowly being comfortable in adopting new and advanced technology. It's fair enough for this country that, for example, in Jesse paper, I saw there are countries that for now doesn't have any stance on artificial intelligence, for example, because they probably want to wait and see how other countries, hosting it. And if Singapore hosted Taylor Swift, perhaps it's not in the polite for other countries, but although we know Indonesia and Malaysia would want to have Taylor Swift. But then the question, how would Singapore that have that technology, that have Taylor Swift, would facilitate that enjoyment for the region, right? And to build the region together, I think the ASEAN way have been able to growing together and not diminishing the competition, but having that rhetoric that together we develop and, build the welfare as the AI guides for, governance and ethics that just recently released in February, have the regional and national recommendation with its principle. So it's not telling country, this is what you need to do. but this is what you recommended to do. Okay, I stop there.
That's a very fair perspective on how to address this. Derek and Jassy, do you have any thoughts on this one?
Sure. Perhaps I'll be basing off my answer from what Elina raised earlier and what Fitri actually echoed just now. At least in the case of the Philippines, Elina shared earlier that, say for example, so ASEAN has used EU as an example, right? I mean, in the case of the Philippines, our privacy law actually came from was actually based from the EU GDPR, and this sounded to me like a classic chicken and egg. Should it come from the EU first, or should it come from ASEAN first? But I think what we should, what ASEAN's contribution for this, at least, should the question should be on what would be ASEAN's value addition to these discussions. And I think what Elina shared earlier, putting people on the planet, the core, is one way forward. And yes, it's actually a matter of growing together, as Fitri just said now.
So I just like to add to this one. Your answer just reminded me like what ASEAN's value add here. So ASEAN actually, like if you observe this whole issue of norms, for instance, ASEAN has a tendency of customizing things that it received from other regions to fit its own needs. So I think this might actually be a way forward when you're talking about how to manage these aspects of emerging tech. But before I move on to the next question, Jassy, do you have anything to add for this one?
Actually, I feel like both Derek and Fitri already at a
Okay.
very fair point. What I want to add is, I feel like, yeah, we say like geopolitics shouldn't be a distraction. And then like the more developed country in the Southeast Asia probably shouldn't like take over the opportunity of the rest of the countries. But I want to give another side of the opinion is that, you know, this kind of competition can really cause innovation, especially in technology. And also it could really push the healthy competitions. And I think another things we should mention is also Southeast Asia, like ASEAN as a whole, they already recognize there's disparities within the regions, and they already, you know, they have a lot of a mechanism to address that. So, for example, like they for the recent thing, they want to facilitate to bridge the gap within the Southeast Asia. So, yeah, 2 points. One is the innovations actually push the healthy competition, and another thing is like they already recognize it.
Yep. So in this case, I think the middle ground that we have here is that there is a fine line between healthy competition that advances everyone's interest, because obviously if your neighbor is working hard to develop these capacities, you also want the same. But then crossing that line leads to unhealthy pathologies and ill will towards one another that can overall be problematic. So the next two questions here actually are related or can actually be tied together. So the first one, the audience member is asking, now that US and China are signaling that they might work together towards AI, to the safety of AI systems, what are the implications of this towards ASEAN? And this relates well to the question immediately following it, with ASEAN releasing its guide on AI governance and ethics. So that being said, that we have great powers that are working, even if their adversarial might be working on the safety of AI systems, and ASEAN itself is already looking at this as well. How does this actually play out within the region itself? Considering that within the region, you have different stages of development. So not all ASEAN states are equal in terms of like what they can and cannot do, both in terms of policy and the technology itself. So how do you guarantee an effective rollout or adoption of these strategies domestically? And what could possibly be the implications of this now that we have the two larger states that are the most relevant in this question with signs that they are starting to cooperate with one another? What would that mean for the region? That's a big question, actually, but I think both are related.
Okay. So I would say now we can also already see like US China, because I mentioned before as well. So US China, they can really they are working on the AI cooperation on safety and effectiveness, despite they have a tension over AI. I think is a positive step to forward as the two AI frontrunners. They are actually collaborating. It's actually good for Southeast Asia as well. But the thing is, like, whether they can really reach the consensus is a question mark, because we know it's not like climate change, this kind of issue is actually AI is sensitive, particularly given the role in the military advancement, and also like the two powers that compete with the AI dominance. So another thing is there's also a high level of distrust between the US and China. So I guess what we can say is like we need to wait and see if there's really any consensus reached between the two superpowers. But the conversation and cooperation is a positive sign for the region. Regarding the question about the ASEAN guide on AI governance and ethics, I would say ASEAN AI guide is actually a voluntary instrument. So it provides guidance to the region, and it also gives them the flexibility to adapt its principles within their own their own context. So I think it's actually great considering the region's diversity. But if you really want to, like bridging the gap and also like to have the real effectiveness of the AI guide, I would say there's a need of awareness campaigns to educate people. There's also like resource sharing platforms, and also you can always consult with more developed countries in the region. So I think that's how the guide and also all the mechanism is played out in the region. I'm not sure if I'm answering the question.
No. I think you raise a fair point there, that it being voluntary is actually quite important, right? Because if capabilities with it relating to these technologies are unevenly distributed, then you cannot be enforcing this on everyone. Some states might have more interest, some states might have less interest, but the fact that it exists here is actually a positive sign. So at least we're not plunging headlong into these things on a very individualistic basis, but at least there's guiding principles here. And I think the question here is that how do you best, so as Fitri mentioned in her remarks, right, that a lot of, for Indonesia, for instance, it's thinking about this is grounded on its traditional approach to its foreign and security policy. So having this guidebook in place aids in letting Indonesia, for instance, think, okay, so how do I fit these two to meet both the regional concerns and domestic concerns as well? So that's my thoughts on it. Maybe Derek and Fitri want to weigh in more on this. If you care to add anything?
Sure. On the question of US and China signaling, yes, I actually agree with Jassy as well that this is a positive development. Also, the Philippines will likewise be more cautious, because we still have to understand that the Chinese and the Americans are still fundamentally different. They view the use of technology a certain way, and of course they have their own policies with regards to that. But the Philippines, at least for the Philippines, it has engaged both sides. I think it would actually depend on the countries themselves. At least in the case of Manila, there should be a need, right, to intensify a more tailored capacity building initiatives. It's not just about the infrastructures anymore. But of course, if the two countries can add the infrastructure into the mix as well, why not? Because the Philippines' needs are different from Indonesia's needs, Malaysia's needs, Singapore's needs. I think I've shared this earlier in my presentation that the Philippines is still lagging in infrastructure, right? We have 7,000 plus islands. All of those islands are still not yet connected to the major hubs, right? There are still far-flung areas that do not have access to internet, and there are initiatives from the Americans to help aid us there. And we're hoping that maybe even the Chinese can come in those modest endeavors. But yeah, I think that's for the Philippines. Yeah, thank you.
For my side, I think it is good as chiming the Jesse and Derek. I think it's good because if the US and China can agree on the AI as creating a standard of international standard, it will make businesses flow and especially looking the impact to ASEAN is when it comes to the region-wide joint infrastructure that relates with each other security and sovereignty. However, if I want to make raise the comment on ASEAN guide on AI governance and ethics, in that guide it said that the AI governance and ethics principle apply to non-military settings. So Jocelyn mentioned how does it impact with the military. I think military, ASEAN don't go there yet. So we're trying to talk about in a joint the common critical information infrastructure that the ASEAN actually held together the region to be safe, and it based itself to tension reduction and trust building.
Yeah, good the point that you raised that the military is not mentioned there, but I think okay, for the time being it's okay, but I believe that there will be a point in time where we reach that question cannot be skirted, especially if you look around AI, for instance, how AI is being presented. At some point in time, ASEAN needs to face that question as well. We're coming up to time, but that's fine. We're down to our last two questions. The second to the last question actually is interesting since Derek just mentioned the need to go beyond the standard capacity building narrative. So this audience member is asking, how do other non-great powers such as Japan, Australia, and the United Nations play a role in shaping ASEAN's policies towards pursuing emergent technologies? And I believe that this is particularly relevant now, since everyone seems to be pivoting towards the region, not specific to AI, for instance, but for cyber, for instance. As far as it seems to me that all the major missions in Singapore have a cyber person in place. So I think it's timely for us to address what can the not usual, quote unquote, not usual actors, what do they have to offer to ASEAN and its individual members when it comes to pursuing these developing policies or even capacities when it comes to these technologies.
If I may.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So since the topic really rested on US and China, right? So some of my remarks were tailored for US and China, but unknown to many. And I'm driving the point of Elina raised earlier that we're really detracting from the new ones of ASEAN, because maybe unknown to others, right? That the Philippines have intensive engagements with Japan, with Australia, and even the South Koreans on digital transformation. It's not just the US and the Chinese. There are also other major players, and the Philippines is actively engaging these other countries. I guess it just so happens that it wasn't right. It wasn't really the main focus, right? But the Philippines is engaging these other countries as well.
Fair point.
May I?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think as Echo Derek said, it's not just US and China, it's actually beyond that. And then what I can see from all the recent regional AI related agreement, let's go from there. So it's not just US, China. We can see external partners, including Australia, EU, and also Japan. They all have the agreement with the regional countries. But what we can see is like mainly Singapore. So I point the few out. The first one is Australia, Singapore MOU. They have a different kind of MOU on cooperating on AI capabilities. There's also a MOU between Singapore and Japan. There's also MOU between Singapore and South Korea. And then, yeah, of course, there's also with Singapore and US and ASEAN with China. So they do have some engagement between the region and then external partner, not just limited to the US and China. But can they go beyond Singapore to other countries? Is also another thing we should think about. Yeah.
Yeah. Fitri, do you have a
Thank you. How to expand the collaboration between the advanced country with country in ASEAN? I think the Indonesian way to do it is through to the business to business cooperation. For example, the manufacturing through the automation, through robotic, and it's not as advanced emerging technology in terms of military and strategic space yet, because that would entails a certain numbers, a certain stage of clearance from the government. So the development that other developing countries brought to Indonesia, it is done through satellite building, also establishing the network backbones, and also cables facility, and the establishment of building the national data center, for example, and smart cities, and it is a slowly creeping attempt to for countries, not only Indonesia, to slowly adopt advanced technology in a way that is based for the people, and it's not in a way that enabling or increasing tension of the great powers, and as well convince the national constituent that the adoption of advanced technology, emerging technology, is for good and for the people's welfare.
Thank you for that point. And this brings us to our last audience question, which I wish would have been easier, but there's nothing easy during this actual webinar to answer. So it seems in the discussion that the way forward in pursuit of emerging technology is fundamentally domestic centric and little on region-wide level. How can ASEAN make a collective approach when the digital divide exists? Okay, so while you think about that, I would share my own thoughts on this one while the rest of the panel, because I do have an answer to this one. So building on my own interest in cyber, for instance, given the challenges that we face at the regional level now, there is a possible way forward with sub-regional partnerships. So countries that member states that are closer, not aligned, but closer in terms of their approach towards these technologies and their capabilities, and these technologies may actually provide a way forward. So building up these sub-regional initiatives and then bridging these sub-regional groups with one another may actually offer a stepping stone towards a more region-wide solution. That's my take on this one. So I'm curious to hear what the others may have to say.
Maybe if I share the Indonesia way of Indonesia aspire to, address the digital divide, both internal within the nation with the different gaps, people with disabilities, women, and elderly as well. But Indonesia attempt to build capacity in the region when its national unicorn was strong, the Gojek as well as Traveloka trying to expand to the region, where at that time the investment was strong to this startup developing unicorn, but we know we're in a time where investment are unpredictable and unsteady, and therefore the attempt probably eclipsed out by the major companies that try to sell their products to countries that is still developing in the region. So Indonesia attempt with its when it's trying to expand Gojek and Traveloka, but resources not sustainable for now.
Fair point. Derek or Jassy?
I would say there is a cooperation and mechanism with the regional. As I mentioned before, there's a DEVA. So they want to bridge the gap, the digital divide within the country. So we cannot overlook this kind of trade agreement within the region. And they also want to establish mechanism for the regulatory cooperation for all the countries, and then for them to keep up with the technological information. So they do have mechanism in the region to facilitate the integration and all that, and they recognize there's a divide in the region and they are working on it. That's the thing. That's a positive way of doing that.
Perfect. Final word on this question from Derek.
I'm actually going to build on what Jassy just said just now. And I'll be faithful to what I've said earlier, right? It's actually the norms among ASEAN member states. You'd have to intensify dialogues on this. We have mechanisms, as Jassy said. You'd have to intensify track 2 discussions, such as this particular event. And we have, as Elina said earlier, we have to bring people at the core. It's really the people, ASEAN people, who will benefit from a more unified, right, a more homogenized stance on what norms to adopt, right, on what norms that would best fit, that would best serve the interest of the entire ASEAN region. That's it.
Perfect. Nice way to round it off. Now that we're in the last 4 minutes of our webinar, I'd invite the panelists to give us their final thoughts, and we'll do this in reverse order. So Derek, kindly take it away. Any final thoughts that you'd like to share to the audience?
Sure. Perhaps I'll be just building up on the study that I've made and the broader policy implications for Manila, right? So we unearthed some points, right? Everything now points to the inevitable trajectory of regulating for IR in the Philippines. In the case of Manila, it's no longer a matter of when. There are now bills precisely aimed at regulating for IR technologies, such as AI. It is more a matter of what form and shape these regulations will take, and how this will be implemented, and how this will be consistent with what ASEAN has in its plate right now. We also found that we need to bring industry stakeholders out of their respective bubbles, right, and compel them to all talk with one another. In the case of the Philippines, discussions on this is still very siloed. And of course, the important insights will come from these experts, right? Broader public awareness and extensive education on for IR needs to be promoted. This is not only for the benefit of employment, but for the protection of rights, particularly of privacy and access to information. For IR is here to stay, present in businesses, even in academia, and dealing with ChatGPT, and it is advancing rapidly in society. Right, the Philippines' preference for the cheapest option is also noteworthy, not just for businesses who want to enter, but also plays into the larger US-China digital strategic competition in the Philippines. So the Philippines must answer the question: from whom will come the next cheap tech alternative? Will it still come from China, or will it now go to other countries, or will it be another party entirely? So I'll end it there. Thank you.
Perfect. Fitri?
Thank you. I think my closing comment would want to say that in the face of the emerging technology, it's not the technology that is pose concern, but whether the country, such as Indonesia, that I focus on, and the region would have the strategic autonomy to be able to adopt and direct the technology and use. And what I think it impinges on is the country and the region having the capacity for adopting and also making decision, also set up its own norms and principle. And I think ASEAN is aware of where it is in terms of size, and therefore realistically it creates norm and how the technology is being played out, instead of like, here you go, this is our technology innovation, but this is the rule of the game if the technology want to come to ASEAN or the countries within. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but not the least, Jassy.
I would just say ASEAN, they want to prioritize its cooperation and autonomy in its pursuit of emergent technology. They don't want to pick side, they want to stay neutral and flexible. And then I also want to highlight it's important to consider the region in this evolving landscape of geopolitics and also technology, because they have the potential. So yeah, that's all.
Thank you very much. And that was a very thought-provoking 90 minutes. The audience put the panelists and myself to task on this issue, but that's what we want to happen during these events. So I would like to first of all thank the panel for their time. I know everyone here is quite busy with their own work, and we very much appreciate you joining us for this session. I'd also like to thank the audience for coming over and being particularly engaged with their questions. So with that in mind, I'm now closing this 10th iteration of the Counterpoint Southeast Asia. Please stay tuned for our future iterations of this webinar and policy brief theory. So I wish everyone enjoy the rest of the day, and thank you.
Thank you, Miguel.
Thank you.
Thank you, Miguel.
Thank you. Thank you.
And Derek,
Yeah.
Jesse, and Counterpoint Asia.
Bye.
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 Bye.